The night air hung thick over Guadalcanal on October 24, 1942. Sergeant Ralph Briggs crouched in his observation post 3,000 yards ahead of the American lines, straining to hear movement in the darkness. What reached his ears made his blood run cold. Singing, laughter, the glow of countless cigarettes moving through the jungle like fireflies, and beneath it all, the rhythmic tramp of thousands of boots. He grabbed the field telephone. "Colonel, there's about 3,000 Japs between you and me." On the other end, Lieutenant Colonel Lewis B. Puller, already known throughout the Marine Corps as Chesty, asked if he was certain.
"Positive.
"They've been all around us, singing and smoking cigarettes, heading your way." Puller hung up and turned to his battalion. The 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, had been on Guadalcanal since September, fighting with equipment that seemed to belong to another war. Most of his men carried bolt-action M1903 Springfield rifles, the same weapon their fathers had used in the trenches of France. They were accurate, reliable, and brutally outmatched by what was coming. The Japanese soldiers moving through that jungle carried their own bolt-action rifles. The Type 38 Arisaka, chambered in 6.5 mm, and the newer Type 99 in 7.7 mm. These were excellent weapons, products of decades of Japanese military tradition. The Type 38 had served since 1905, had proven itself in the Russo-Japanese War, and had been refined to near perfection. Japanese soldiers trained with them until they could work the bolt with mechanical precision, achieving respectable rates of fire through sheer discipline and practice. But on this night, advancing toward Henderson Field with supreme confidence, the Japanese Imperial Army was about to discover something that would shatter their understanding of infantry combat. Not all the Americans waiting in those defensive positions carried bolt-action rifles. Some carried something new, something the Japanese High Command had heard about but didn't fully understand, something that would transform this battle into a nightmare. The M1 Garand. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. To understand what happened that night and in the months that followed, we must first understand the world these soldiers came from. A world where both armies believed deeply in the supremacy of their own weapons and tactics. A world where assumptions about warfare were about to collide with devastating reality. The Japanese Imperial Army of 1942 operated under a military doctrine that had evolved over decades. At its core lay the concept of Bushido, the way of the warrior, adapted and weaponized by the militarist government to create soldiers who viewed death in battle as the highest honor. This wasn't mere propaganda. It was a carefully constructed ideology that had been drilled into every Japanese soldier from the moment he entered training. The Banzai charge embodied this philosophy perfectly. The term itself came from the battle cry Tenno Heika Banzai, meaning "Long live His Majesty the Emperor," shortened simply to Banzai. When a commander ordered a Banzai charge, soldiers were expected to fix bayonets and rush enemy positions in a massed frontal assault, accepting death as inevitable and honorable. Surrender was unthinkable. Retreat was shameful. Only victory or death were acceptable outcomes. This tactic had worked. That's the crucial detail that's often forgotten. In China, during the 1930s, Japanese forces using Banzai charges had repeatedly defeated larger Chinese formations. Chinese soldiers were often armed with bolt-action rifles, many of them old or poorly maintained, with limited ammunition. They faced Japanese soldiers trained to work their rifle bolts with extraordinary speed, supplemented by excellent light machine guns like the Type 96. When Japanese forces closed to bayonet range through determined assault, Chinese formations frequently broke and fled. These successes created a dangerous confidence within the Japanese military establishment. If disciplined soldiers with superior fighting spirit could overcome numerical disadvantages in China, why not against Western forces? The Americans, Japanese officers told their men, were soft, decadent. They loved comfort and feared death. When faced with the terrifying sight of hundreds of screaming Japanese soldiers charging with fixed bayonets, American troops would surely break and run just as the Chinese had. The Type 38 Arisaka rifle seemed perfectly suited to this doctrine. Weighing 8.7 pounds with a barrel length of 31.3 inches, it fired a mild 6.5mm cartridge that produced little recoil. This made it easy for soldiers to fire rapidly and accurately. The rifle's action was based on the Mauser design but simplified and strengthened. Post-war testing by American forces would reveal that the Type 38 had the strongest bolt action of any rifle in World War II, capable of handling cartridges more powerful than those it was designed for. More importantly, the 6.5mm round allowed soldiers to carry more ammunition. The mild recoil meant they could maintain accuracy even during rapid fire. And in the jungle combat that characterized the Pacific War, where most engagements occurred at ranges under 200 meters, the Type 38 was entirely adequate. Japanese military leadership saw no need to change a system that had proven successful, but there was a problem, one that Japanese commanders either didn't see or refused to acknowledge. The Type 38 had earned a reputation among Chinese forces for lack of stopping power. The small 6.5mm bullet would pass clean through a target without causing incapacitating damage. Stories circulated of Chinese soldiers being shot multiple times and continuing to fight. This wasn't a critical flaw when facing poorly equipped opponents, but it would become significant when facing better armed forces. By 1939, combat experience in China had convinced some Japanese officers that a more powerful cartridge was needed. This led to the development of the Type 99 rifle, chambered in 7.7mm. The cartridge was based on the British .303 round with the rim removed, producing a muzzle velocity of about 2,400 feet per second, and significantly more stopping power than the 6.5mm. The Type 99 was shorter and lighter than the Type 38, at 44 inches and 8.4 pounds respectively, with a barrel length of 26 inches. It came equipped with some optimistic features, including anti-aircraft sights, and a wire monopod for stability when firing at low-flying aircraft. These additions reflected Japanese concerns about Allied air superiority, but had little practical value in combat. Production of the Type 99 began ramping up, with the intention of completely replacing the Type 38 by war's end. But this created a significant logistics problem. Now, Japanese forces were using two different rifle calibers, requiring two different supply chains for ammunition. Units that received the new rifles found themselves unable to share ammunition with units still using the old rifles. In the chaos of Pacific Island warfare, with supply lines constantly disrupted, this incompatibility would prove disastrous. Still, both rifles shared one fundamental characteristic. They were bolt-action repeaters, requiring the soldier to manually cycle the bolt after each shot. This ejected the spent cartridge and chambered a fresh round from the 5-round internal magazine. The cycle was simple: fire, pull the bolt handle up and back, push it forward and down, fire again. A well-trained Japanese soldier could achieve 15 to 20 aimed shots per minute. Some exceptional marksmen could fire even faster. Japanese military leadership considered this entirely sufficient. After all, every army in the world used bolt-action rifles as their primary infantry weapon. The British had the Lee Enfield, the Germans used the Mauser Karabiner 98K, the Soviets carried the Mosin Nagant, the Americans themselves had the M1903 Springfield. Bolt-action rifles were the standard, proven in decades of warfare, reliable and simple to manufacture. The Japanese also fielded excellent machine guns. The Type 92 heavy machine gun, chambered in 7.7mm, was robust and reliable despite its odd cartridge feed system using metal strips. The Type 96 light machine gun was well regarded by both Japanese troops and the American soldiers who faced it. Lieutenant Colonel John B. George, who served with the 164th Infantry Regiment on Guadalcanal, would later write in his memoir, Shots Fired in Anger, that he would rather carry a Type 96 than an American Browning automatic rifle. But machine guns were heavy, specialized weapons assigned to specific squads. The heart of Japanese infantry tactics remained the individual rifleman, trained to work his bolt with mechanical efficiency, to close with the enemy through determined assault, and to prevail through superior fighting spirit and tactical discipline. This entire system was based on one critical assumption: that their enemies would fight the same way. That combat would follow familiar patterns where disciplined soldiers with bolt-action rifles maneuvered for position, where fire superiority came from careful placement of machine guns, where battles were won through tactical skill and fighting spirit. On Guadalcanal, that assumption was about to be violently disproven. The Americans waiting in defensive positions around Henderson Field in October 1942 represented a military in transition. The Marines of the 1st Division had landed in August with M1903 Springfield rifles, the same bolt-action weapon that had served American forces since Theodore Roosevelt's administration. The Springfield was beloved by Marines who valued its long-range accuracy and reliability. It had proven itself in the trenches of World War I and through the banana wars of the 1920s and 30s. But some American units on Guadalcanal carried something different, something that represented the most significant advancement in infantry small arms since the development of the bolt-action rifle itself. The United States had adopted the M1 Garand rifle in 1936, making America the first nation in the world to standardize a semi-automatic rifle for general infantry use. The design was the work of John Cantius Garand, a self-taught mechanical engineer born in Quebec in 1888 who had immigrated to the United States as a child. Working at Springfield Armory, Garand had spent over a decade refining his gas-operated, rotating bolt design. The M1 was revolutionary in its simplicity and effectiveness. When the soldier pulled the trigger, the rifle fired, and a portion of the expanding gas from the cartridge was tapped off through a port in the barrel. This gas drove a long-stroke piston that cycled the action, extracting the spent cartridge case, ejecting it, and loading a fresh round from the 8-round en-bloc clip. The entire cycle took a fraction of a second. As fast as the soldier could pull the trigger, the rifle would fire. 8 rounds, semi-automatic fire, no manual cycling required. The implications were staggering. A soldier with an M1 Garand could deliver sustained, aimed fire at 3 to 4 times the rate of a soldier with a bolt-action rifle. Where a man with a Springfield might manage 15 aimed shots per minute, a man with a Garand could fire 30 to 40 rounds with equal or better accuracy. The rifle's gas operation also absorbed much of the recoil, making it easier to keep the weapon on target during rapid fire. The weapon wasn't perfect. At 9.5 pounds, it was heavier than most bolt-action rifles. The 8-round en-bloc clip system meant the rifle couldn't be topped off with loose rounds. When the last cartridge was fired, the empty clip ejected with a distinctive metallic ping that would become famous, and soldiers new to the weapon sometimes suffered M1 thumb when loading, if they failed to pull their thumb clear before the bolt slammed forward on a fresh clip. But these were minor inconveniences compared to the overwhelming advantage in firepower the weapon provided. General George S. Patton would later call it the greatest battle implement ever devised. General Douglas MacArthur, commanding forces in the Pacific, reported to the Ordnance Department in early 1942 that, under combat conditions, it operated with no mechanical defects, and when used in foxholes did not develop stoppages from dust or dirt. The Marine Corps had been slower to adopt the Garand than the Army. Marines treasured the accuracy of their Springfield rifles and initially viewed the semi-automatic's high rate of fire as wasteful of ammunition. But combat has a way of changing minds. When Army reinforcements arrived on Guadalcanal in October 1942, many carrying M1 Garands, Marines immediately recognized the value of the weapon. Some Marines liberated Garands from Army supply dumps or traded with Army soldiers for them, eager to get their hands on the superior firepower. The men who faced the Japanese assault on October 24th had a mix of weapons: Springfield armed Marines who had been on the island since August, Army troops with Garands who had just arrived as reinforcements, and everyone knew that the Japanese were coming. The Japanese 17th Army under Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake had brought significant forces to Guadalcanal. The general was supremely confident. He had even ordered his staff to begin preparations for accepting the American surrender, planning a ceremony that would be the envy of every unit in the Japanese army. Code signal for the expected victory. Banzai. On the night of October 23rd, the Japanese artillery opened fire, lighting up the sky over Henderson Field. The bombardment was followed by a tank assault, 9 light tanks attempting to break through Marine lines. American anti-tank weapons and artillery destroyed all 9 tanks. Japanese infantry following behind the tanks ran into a killing zone. 40 howitzers supported by mortars had the range precisely calculated. 6,000 rounds dropped on the advancing Japanese formations before they could mount any coordinated attack. Marine patrols the next day counted 600 dead, but this was just the opening move. The main assault was still coming, and when it came, it would reveal a truth that Japanese military leadership had failed to grasp. The advantage in firepower provided by the M1 Garand wasn't just incremental, it was revolutionary. Consider what happened just 2 weeks after the Marines landed on Guadalcanal. On August 21, 1942, Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki led 800 soldiers of the Ichiki Regiment in a direct assault on Marine positions along what the Americans called the Tenaru River. It was actually Alligator Creek, but the name stuck. Ichiki had been briefed at the Japanese naval base at Truk that American forces on Guadalcanal numbered between 2,000 and 10,000 men, and that he should avoid frontal attacks. But when Japanese aerial reconnaissance spotted few troops in the open, Ichiki became convinced the Americans had withdrawn most of their forces. He decided to attack immediately and recapture Henderson Field in one bold stroke. He was catastrophically wrong. Over 11,000 American troops held Guadalcanal, and they were waiting. Just after midnight, Japanese troops began moving into position. A local scout named Jacob Vosa, who had been captured and tortured by the Japanese but escaped, managed to reach Marine lines minutes before the assault and warn them of the attack. The Marines were ready. At 1:30 in the morning, Japanese machine guns and mortars opened fire. Then came the Banzai charge. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers screaming "Tenno Heika Banzai" rushed across the sandbar at the mouth of Alligator Creek, bayonets fixed, determined to overwhelm the American position through sheer courage and ferocity. They ran directly into concentrated machine gun fire and canister rounds from Marine artillery. The Marines, many armed, with bolt-action M1903 Springfields, worked their rifles as fast as they could, but the volume of fire came primarily from Browning machine guns positioned to create interlocking fields of fire across the sandbar. Most of the Japanese were killed before they even reached Marine positions. A few broke through and engaged in desperate hand-to-hand combat in Marine foxholes. Marine Corporal Lee Diamond, Private First Class John Rivers, and Private Al Schmid, manning a machine gun position, bore the brunt of one assault. Schmid would later be blinded by a Japanese grenade but continued firing his machine gun until the position was secure. All 3 men would become heroes of the battle. A second wave of up to 200 Japanese troops charged across the same sandbar at 2:30. They met the same fate. Against the advice of survivors, Ichiki ordered a third assault, adding mortar support. At 5 in the morning, Japanese troops attempted to wade through the ocean surf and attack along the beach. Marine machine guns and artillery cut them down in the water. By daybreak, the Banzai charges had failed completely. Now the Marines counterattacked. They flanked Japanese positions from the south and east, cutting off retreat. Aircraft from Henderson Field strafed fleeing Japanese soldiers. M3 Stuart light tanks rolled across the sandbar and crushed Japanese positions in the coconut grove beyond. By 5 in the evening, organized Japanese resistance had ended. Colonel Ichiki, realizing the magnitude of his defeat, committed seppuku. Out of 917 men in Ichiki's detachment, only about 30 escaped. Over 800 Japanese soldiers lay dead. American casualties, 41 killed. The disparity was stunning, and it revealed something Japanese commanders didn't want to acknowledge. Banzai charges, which had worked so effectively against Chinese forces, were suicidal against American firepower. But the lesson wasn't learned. Or, Perhaps it couldn't be learned, because the alternative was to admit that Japanese military doctrine itself was fundamentally flawed when facing an enemy with superior firepower. Which brings us back to October 24, 1942, and the largest Japanese offensive yet on Guadalcanal. Lieutenant General Hyakutake had brought significant forces to the island. This time, the Japanese weren't underestimating American strength. This time, they brought artillery, including 100mm cannon and 150mm howitzers. This time, they planned to use overwhelming force. The night of October 24th saw desperate fighting along a ridgeline south of Henderson Field. Japanese forces, led by elements of the 16th and 29th Infantry Regiments, launched massive assaults against positions held primarily by the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines under Lieutenant Colonel Chesty. Puller's Marines, many still carrying M1903, Springfields, fought with every weapon they had. But the situation was desperate. The Japanese kept coming in waves, and Marine positions were in danger of being overrun. Then, Army reinforcements arrived. 2 battalions from the 164th Infantry Regiment, most of them National Guard troops from South Dakota, who had just landed on Guadalcanal. And crucially, many of them carried M1 Garand rifles. Some Marines immediately liberated Garands from the Army troops. They'd heard about the semi-automatic rifles. Some had seen them in training. But this would be the first time most Marines encountered the weapon in combat conditions. What happened next would enter Marine Corps legend. The Japanese attacked in their traditional style. Screaming, "Banzai!" Hundreds of soldiers charged Marine and Army positions with fixed bayonets. In the darkness, illuminated by flares and tracer fire, it must have seemed like something from a nightmare. A wall of determined soldiers rushing forward, accepting death as inevitable, trusting that their courage would carry them through American lines. Against troops armed with bolt-action rifles, this tactic had a chance. A bolt-action rifleman could fire perhaps 15 rounds per minute if he was skilled and didn't panic. Against a massed charge of hundreds of men, each individual rifleman could only engage a handful of targets before the enemy closed to hand-to-hand range. But against troops with M1 Garands, the mathematics of combat changed completely. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. A soldier with a Garand could fire 30 to 40 aimed rounds per minute, 8 rounds as fast as he could pull the trigger, then a 2-second reload from an en-bloc clip, then 8 more rounds. The semi-automatic action meant the weapon stayed on target. There was no need to break shooting position to work a bolt. No, lost time between shots. Just continuous, devastating fire. American soldiers and Marines armed with Garands found they could engage multiple targets in the time it would take a bolt-action rifleman to engage one. As Japanese soldiers charged across open ground, Garand-armed troops could drop man after man before the enemy even got close. One Marine would later describe it in stark terms. As 8 Japs came charging at him with fixed bayonets, the American Marine dropped all of them with his trusty M1 Garand. The loud ping of the ejecting clip was heard by his comrades as the last Jap fell to the ground. This account, while perhaps embellished, captured the essential truth. The M1 Garand gave individual soldiers the firepower to stop multiple attackers in the seconds it took for a Banzai charge to cross a kill zone. The Japanese casualties mounted horrifically. Wave after wave of soldiers charged into concentrated American fire. Machine guns, mortars, artillery, and now the devastating rapid fire of hundreds of Garand rifles created an almost impenetrable wall of lead. Japanese soldiers displayed incredible courage, continuing to advance even as their comrades fell around them. But courage alone couldn't overcome the physics of semi-automatic firepower. By morning, the ground in front of American positions was carpeted with Japanese dead. One photograph from the aftermath shows bodies piled so thick that the earth is barely visible. A torn Japanese flag sticks up from the ground like a grave marker. American casualties were severe, nearly 1,000 killed and wounded, but Japanese losses were catastrophic. Approximately 3,000 dead in a single night of fighting. The pattern would repeat throughout the Guadalcanal campaign. Japanese forces would attack with determination and courage. American firepower, increasingly including the M1 Garand, would cut them down. By the time Japanese forces evacuated Guadalcanal in February 1943, American control of the island was complete. But the most dramatic demonstration of how Banzai charges fared against American firepower would come 2 years later, on an island called Saipan. By July 1944, the war in the Pacific had turned decisively against Japan. American forces had island-hopped their way across the Pacific, drawing ever closer to the Japanese home islands. The Mariana Islands, including Saipan, were part of Japan's inner defense perimeter. Their loss would put the Japanese homeland within range of American B-29 Superfortress bombers. Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito commanded approximately 31,000 Japanese troops on Saipan. They fought with everything they had, using caves and fortified positions to exact a terrible price from attacking American forces. But by early July, American Marines and Army troops had pushed Japanese forces into the northern corner of the island. Saito knew all was lost. On July 6th, Saito sent a final message to Tokyo, apologizing for failing to defend Saipan. Then he committed ritual suicide. But before his death, he ordered something unprecedented. Every remaining able-bodied soldier, every walking wounded man, even Japanese civilians on the island, were to participate in one final Banzai charge. One last desperate attempt to strike back at the Americans before the end. Saito had already witnessed what American firepower could do. He understood this charge would fail, but Japanese military culture left no alternative. Surrender was unthinkable. The only honorable course was to die attacking. In the early morning hours of July 7th, approximately 4,300 Japanese soldiers and civilians gathered for the charge. Many had no weapons. Some carried only grenades. Others wielded bamboo spears. But they all shared one conviction: they would die for the Emperor. The target was the 27th Infantry Division's 105th Infantry Regiment, positioned near Tanapag Harbour. The Americans had been fighting for 3 weeks and were exhausted, but they knew the Japanese were trapped. They expected a final assault. Just before dawn, the silence was shattered by screams of "Banzai!" Thousands of Japanese soldiers and civilians surged forward in the largest Banzai charge of the entire Pacific War. The charge hit the seam between the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 105th Infantry. Japanese forces broke through the American front line in several places, engaging in brutal hand-to-hand combat. For a moment, it seemed the charge might succeed in reaching American artillery positions and supply dumps. But the Americans rallied. Machine guns, mortars, artillery, and hundreds of M1 Garand rifles opened fire. The volume of fire was beyond anything Japanese forces had experienced. American soldiers fired until their weapons were too hot to touch, then grabbed other weapons and kept firing. Captain Benjamin Salomon, a dentist serving as the battalion surgeon, found himself defending the aid station with wounded men still inside. He sent the wounded to safety, then took up a machine gun and held off attacking Japanese forces. When American troops retook the position, they found Salomon dead, surrounded by 98 dead Japanese soldiers. He would eventually be awarded the Medal of Honor 78 years after his death. Private Thomas Baker, already wounded multiple times, asked to be propped against a tree with his pistol when his squad had to retreat. When Americans returned, they found Baker dead, surrounded by 8 dead Japanese soldiers, his pistol empty. The Banzai charge lasted 15 hours. When it finally ended at 1800 hours on July 7th, the carnage was almost incomprehensible. Over 4,300 Japanese soldiers and civilians lay dead. The entire assault force had been virtually annihilated. American casualties were also severe. 406 killed and 512 wounded in the 105th Infantry alone. But the Americans had held. And more importantly, they had demonstrated conclusively that no amount of courage or fighting spirit could overcome the firepower disparity between bolt-action rifles and semi-automatic weapons. Japanese military leadership finally understood what they were facing. In 1944, as American forces pushed ever closer to the home islands, the Japanese Navy began a desperate project. Using captured M1 Garand rifles from the Philippines, Japanese engineers at Yokosuka Naval Arsenal attempted to reverse engineer the weapon. They created the Type 4 rifle, also called the Type 5. It was essentially a Japanese copy of the Garand, modified to fire the 7.7mm Arisaka cartridge, and using a 10-round internal magazine charged by two 5-round stripper clips instead of the Garand's 8-round en-bloc clip. The fact that Japan, in the middle of a desperate war, devoted resources to copying an enemy weapon speaks volumes. It was an implicit admission that American small arms technology had leapfrogged Japanese capabilities. The Banzai charge, that cornerstone of Japanese tactical doctrine, had become a form of suicide when facing enemies armed with semi-automatic rifles. But the Type 4 came too late. Design work began in 1944. Plans called for mass production in 1945. But Japan surrendered in August 1945. Only about 250 examples were manufactured, and fewer than 100 were actually completed. The Type 4 never saw combat. The lessons of Guadalcanal, Saipan, and dozens of other Pacific battles were clear. The M1 Garand had given American forces a decisive advantage in infantry combat. General Patton's assessment, the greatest battle implement ever devised, wasn't hyperbole, it was simple fact. The rifle combined reliability, firepower, and ease of use in a way that no other infantry weapon of World War II matched. While other nations experimented with semi-automatic rifles, only America fully equipped its forces with them. Soviet SVT-40 rifles were issued in limited numbers. German G-43 rifles came late in the war and in small quantities, but every American rifleman carried a Garand. The psychological impact on Japanese forces was profound. Soldiers who had been taught they possessed superior fighting spirit, who believed their determination could overcome any obstacle, faced the brutal reality that their tactics were obsolete. The Banzai charge, which had worked against poorly armed Chinese forces, was revealed as suicide against American firepower. Some Japanese commanders recognized this. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, who would later command forces on Iwo Jima, explicitly forbade his men from conducting Banzai charges. He understood that preserving his forces in defensive positions was far more effective than throwing them away in futile assaults. The brutal battle for Iwo Jima proved him right. American casualties were enormous because Japanese forces fought from prepared positions rather than charging into American fire. But by then, the pattern was established. Japanese military doctrine, built on concepts of fighting spirit and honorable death, had collided with American industrial might and technological innovation. The M1 Garand was just one example, but it was a perfect symbol of that collision. The rifle represented everything about American military thinking that differed from Japanese doctrine. It was designed for mass production. It prioritized reliability over theoretical perfection. It was easy to train soldiers to use. It could be maintained by men with minimal technical training. And most importantly, it gave individual soldiers overwhelming firepower. These weren't compromises. They were conscious design choices based on understanding what modern warfare required. The Americans had learned from World War I that firepower won battles. They had invested in developing a weapon that multiplied each soldier's effectiveness, and they had committed to equipping every rifleman with that weapon, regardless of the cost and logistical challenges. The Japanese made different choices. They stuck with proven bolt-action rifles because they worked, because they were cheaper to produce, because changing an entire army's equipment in the middle of a war seemed impossible. They believed fighting spirit and tactical skill could compensate for technological disadvantages. They were wrong. The numbers tell the story. American industrial production during World War II was staggering, Over 5 million M1 Garand rifles were manufactured. American factories were producing Garands at rates Japanese factories couldn't match even for their simpler bolt-action rifles. The Type 38 and Type 99 Arisaka rifles, excellent weapons in their own right, were simply outclassed by a weapon that could fire 3 times faster with equal accuracy. By the war's end, the lessons were undeniable. The Banzai charge, that tactic born of Bushido tradition and military indoctrination, had proven to be a death sentence when facing modern, automatic and semi-automatic weapons. Japanese casualties in these charges were horrific. At Attu in May 1943, 2,600 Japanese soldiers charged American positions. 28 survived. At Saipan in July 1944, 4,300 charged. Virtually none survived. These weren't battles. They were massacres, and they demonstrated beyond any doubt that in modern warfare, firepower mattered more than fighting spirit. The legacy of these battles extended far beyond World War II. The M1 Garand would serve American forces through the Korean War and into the early years of Vietnam. It would be replaced eventually by the M14 and then the M16, but the principle remained the same. Give infantry soldiers the maximum firepower possible in a reliable, easy-to-use package. The Japanese military, rebuilt after the war, would adopt very different approaches. The Japan Self-Defense Forces would never again base their doctrine on mass infantry charges or fighting spirit over firepower. They would become one of the most technologically advanced military forces in the world, learning from the painful lessons of the Pacific War. For the American soldiers and Marines who faced those Banzai charges, the memory never faded. They had witnessed courage beyond comprehension, Japanese soldiers charging into certain death, screaming for their emperor, accepting annihilation rather than surrender. It was terrifying, heartbreaking, and ultimately futile. One Marine who fought on Guadalcanal would later reflect, "They were brave. God knows they were brave. But bravery isn't enough when the other side can shoot 8 times to your 1. We didn't win because we were braver or tougher. We won because we had better weapons. Sometimes it's that simple." In the end, the story of the M1 Garand and the Banzai charge isn't really about weapons at all. It's about how military cultures respond when their fundamental assumptions are proven wrong. The Japanese military believed in fighting spirit, in courage, in willingness to die for the emperor. These weren't bad values in themselves, but when they prevented tactical adaptation, when they led commanders to keep sending men to certain death rather than acknowledge that their doctrine was obsolete, they became fatal. The Americans, for all their faults, understood that war was ultimately about practical effectiveness. The best weapon wasn't the most elegant or the most traditional. It was the one that worked. The best tactic wasn't the bravest. It was the one that achieved objectives while preserving your own forces. The M1 Garand embodied that pragmatic philosophy. It wasn't perfect. It was heavy. The en-bloc clip system had limitations. The distinctive ping when the clip ejected could theoretically alert enemies that a soldier was reloading. But these were minor flaws in a weapon that fundamentally changed infantry combat. When Japanese commanders mocked American weapons, when they dismissed American soldiers as soft and undisciplined, they were making a fatal mistake. They were judging their enemy by their own values, rather than recognizing that different approaches to warfare could be equally valid. More than that, they failed to understand that industrial capacity and technological innovation could create advantages that no amount of fighting spirit could overcome. The battlefields of the Pacific proved this in the most brutal way possible. Japanese soldiers charged American positions over and over, displaying courage that even their enemies had to admire. And over, they were cut down by the rapid fire of M1 Garands and Browning machine guns. The mathematics of firepower proved stronger than the spirit of Bushido. By the time Japanese engineers created their copy of the Garand, the Type 4 rifle, it was far too late. The battles were already lost. The home islands were under bombardment. Atomic weapons would soon make conventional ground combat irrelevant. The war was over, and the lessons had been written in blood across dozens of Pacific islands. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.